Hello and welcome, everyone. Finally, we're here. We apologize for the technical problems that we had, which literally started 1 minute before we were about to go live. So appreciate your patience. Very excited to be here today. My name is Leslie Kean, and I've got three extraordinary people here who are joining us from the Disclosure Foundation. We're going to hear about what that group has been up to and is planning to accomplish in the future. Just brief introductions. We have Chris Mellon with us today, who's the chairman of the board of the Disclosure Foundation. Chris was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence and also a minority staff director for the Senate Intelligence Committee. We're also joined by Jordan Flowers, who is the executive director of the Disclosure Foundation, and he has over 20 years experience in finance and operational roles at firms such as McKinsey & Company, Houlihan Lokey, and LGT Capital Partners. And last but not least, we are also joined by Hunt Willis. He is a trial attorney in state and financial courts in the southeastern United States. And he's currently serving as the chief legal officer on the Disclosure Foundation board of directors. So welcome, the three of you. We're really excited to hear from you. We have lots of questions that Reddit people have submitted to this conversation, and it's going to be great. I just wanted to briefly focus on one kind of important news item that happened only last night. As many viewers may know, James Fox and I co-hosted a press conference last Tuesday on Capitol Hill with members of Congress and featuring David Grusch, and Jordan was actually there with us too. And last night, David Grusch went on Fox and kind of went further than he's ever gone before in terms of describing very specifically that he has seen photographs of crash retrievals. He says crash retrieval photos and everything. Whatever the everything is, we don't know, but he has seen these photographs of recovered vehicles. And he talked about how they changed his worldview. And what was really interesting was he talked about some of the specific types of craft that were in these photographs that he saw, such as lenticular discs and crescent moon-shaped craft and flattened sunfish, egg-shaped craft, boomerangs. All of these things he actually has now acknowledged he witnessed himself with photographs. And he also said that he believes that these photographs will eventually be released by the current administration. So that is very exciting. That certainly will be a major moment if that happens. I just wanted to acknowledge this kind of development because I think it's really interesting. And David is also going on with Jake Tapper on Monday on CNN. So he might have more to say there as well. So anyway, just to focus on that. I don't know if any of you folks want to comment on that development, but it is pretty startling and pretty exciting as far as I'm concerned. Does anybody want to say anything about that?
I've also, like Dave, heard from some senior administration officials that they are very serious and under serious pressure from the White House to get out literally as much as possible. It was a very encouraging message from people in associated with the administration who are working the problem. And they asked me what I would prioritize, and I gave them some suggestions. So I'm very hopeful that, along with Dave, that these future releases will continue and hopefully improve.
Fantastic. I've heard the same thing, that there are people working closely with Trump who are deeply committed to this. So it's pretty exciting. So since we have three key members here from the Disclosure Foundation, do you guys want to just give us a brief synopsis of what you're doing and who you are and what the organization is all about?
Sure, Leslie, I'm happy to do that. And thank you so much again for having us here today. We really appreciate it. And thank you and James, particularly for all the hard work you did in putting together the press conference from last week. I think that really helped move the needle. This issue really is breaking through into mainstream media, which is, I think, a big success. So with regard to our organization, so We are the Disclosure Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to transparency around the UAP topic. We like to say at the Disclosure Foundation that we have three legs of the stool for what our efforts are in this space. The first is policy work, sort of like a think tank, and policy research. So we've issued various policy memos on the UAP topic. The second leg of that stool is our legal component, which Hunt helps run. And that focuses around, number one, whistleblower protection, potential whistleblower representation, and also FOIA efforts, trying to get information released that hasn't been out before. And I think most importantly, having a credible threat of litigation for any information that we really need to appeal and go to court in order to get out. And we've had some wins on that front that Hunt can address. And the third leg of the stool is education and advocacy. So this is work that we do in the public. This is going to different clubs and institutions around the U.S., speaking about UAP, as well as having strong relationships in Congress that we try to problem solve about how we can achieve transparency for the UAP topic.
Wonderful. And I'm very much looking forward to the event you have coming up on June 25th, on which probably a lot of viewers are aware, but I don't know if you want to quickly say something about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So on June 25th, we have our disclosure forum. And at that event, it really is, I think, setting up to be a watershed moment. We have been sponsored by Senator Rounds to have the Kennedy Caucus Room for this event. The Kennedy Caucus Room itself is an historic venue where the Watergate hearings were held. You know, issues of national import have been discussed in this room. I think the setting could not be better. We are going to be in a credible setting with credible people speaking credibly about the UAP topic. And we will have multiple senators who will be speaking. We'll have members of Congress from the House Oversight Committee, as well as there's one of the big goals for this event is trying to begin the conversation of problem solving for the UAP topic. So what does disclosure mean? What is the impact going to be across various disciplines? And how can we start thinking about how to problem solve that now? So we will have a panel on national security trying to address that issue, a panel on science, a panel on technology and innovation, a panel on religion and philosophy, and psychology as well. I'm particularly excited about the work that some of our partners are doing about stigma and cognitive bias in this subject and how we can shine a light on that. So we're really excited for the day, for the event, and for the potential to break through with some of our mainstream media partners in that as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. We're really looking forward to it.
Well, I am too, and it's very exciting that that's happening. I think we can go to the first question now, which deals with the question of disclosure. And the question is, it's submitted from RUFOB, submitted by Familiar Paper 8076. And the question is, why has disclosure been blocked for so long? What are the main reasons this is changing? And once disclosure happens, what do you believe will change? So anybody who wants to tackle that one? Chris, do you have something you want to say about that?
That's a huge question, set of questions there. I think the reason that things have changed, Leslie, and you're very familiar with all of this, is that information has been brought to bear publicly that the administration could no longer deny. So we confronted them in 2017 via the New York Times and other press, and then on the Hill with Navy pilots and with videos that were authentic, impressive, clearly spoke to a vital national security concern, and they simply could not deny that. And we sort of crossed a Rubicon there, and Congress, the oversight committees in particular began to realize that we have a serious issue and problem here, and we got traction. We got them to request an annual report on UAP sightings, which has also helped to raise awareness. And so as more and more people become acquainted with the facts on the Hill and elsewhere, there's a growing recognition of the reality and the challenges and problems. If we get to the point where there's actual confirmation that we're not alone, that some higher intelligence is visiting this planet and active here, say through the White House, that will be a absolutely stunning development, unlike anything that has happened before, which makes it a little bit more difficult to gauge because it will be so unprecedented. But that is, in fact, a large part of the reason we're holding this forum on the 26th. For a long time, people have been banging the door on disclosure and not asking what happens when we open that Pandora's box. Is it really in the best interest of the country, or how might we manage the negative impacts and so forth? That's part of what we feel needs to be discussed that hasn't been discussed. Kind of like the old trial attorney sage advice: don't ask a question if you don't know the answer. We're not going to necessarily know the answer, but we at least want to talk about the question and the impacts. So I don't know what the impacts will be, but my personal belief is that they're going to be ultimately extremely positive. And that's why I work so hard for disclosure, because I believe that when we achieve it, it's going to have incredible, far-reaching positive impacts. And part of the reason I say that is because the greatest threats to our species, the greatest threats to our planet, are things the United States cannot solve itself, or any other country. Global warming, AI, weapons of mass destruction, biotechnology, terrorism. All these things require close international collaboration, and there's nothing I can conceive of that would do more to change the perspective of world leaders towards a more collaborative and cooperative perspective than introducing the fact that we're not alone. And assuming we don't know the agenda of this other intelligence, we need to begin working together to think about that and to make sure that we're able to constructively deal with that. So I think a lot of positive things would flow at the highest strategic level, down to technologies that we might acquire and other things. And if that's an overly optimistic view, then we need to know that too. But that's a lot of what we'll be talking about on June 25th.
Wonderful. Yeah. It is a huge question. So if nobody else wants to comment, we can go on to the next question. Unless either of you other two want to say anything.
I'm happy to sort of pile on there. We hear a lot of, what Chris is saying, and with the event, like, ask questions, try and move into problem solving mode. There's no shortage of narrative around what would happen there. You have heard it would be destabilizing. There would be riots in the streets. People would lose their faith. These types of arguments. I mean, we really have like a message, I think, of hope and inspiration and opportunity that would come out of this. I know, for example, a few of the speakers at our event. One is a Yale professor, Dr. Carlos Ayer, who wrote a book called They Flew. I'm really excited to hear his speech at the forum. And I was just speaking with him a few days ago about, how he really thinks that while he sees the potential for some issues, sees this as a huge positive opportunity for us to acknowledge this and to move forward, and that really the lying and the secrecy is so much more destructive than the truth would be. So it's there's all these narratives out there. There's another narrative about the markets would tank. if this information were to be made public. Again, there's literally no evidence to support a conclusion like that. The market, when Trump made his like executive order by tweet about releasing the information on this subject, go back and look, right? That day, I think that was a holiday, but the following day and then that week, the markets were up or flat, like when he made that announcement. The markets have generally been moving up with each one of the releases from the administration through the Pursue program, right? There's been no indication, there was no fact base that actually supports that there would be a negative market impact from the release of this information. So we're really trying to bring to bear, and by contrast, there's significant opportunity for technology and innovation that could come from this. And we will also be having some people from MIT who I've worked personally with. A gentleman named Jonathan Miller had a course called Confronting Unknowns that I participated in as a contributor, and trying to find where are the opportunities in the marketplace for that we could benefit from this. So part of this problem solving really is trying to take these lazy narratives that benefit certain people and actually analyze them objectively to try to come to good conclusions. So there's a lot there, but it's yet another reason why we're excited to try and dive in deeper on these questions at the forum.
Wonderful. I mean, just to add, I feel like there may be some disruption in society initially, but even if there is, that's not a reason to not disclose, because we will recover from any disruptions that occur, as I see it. I mean, we've been through lots of trauma, as a civilization, and we always recover and we move forward. So I don't see why, concerns about temporary disruptions really would be an argument against it. We're very resilient. And as Chris said, the bigger meaning of what it is far outweighs, as far as I'm concerned, any concern about that. I mean, everybody on the planet is entitled to know we're not alone, regardless of what disruptions might occur. That's the way I position this. And also, I just wanted to add, because I just saw Disclosure Day, which I know you've seen too, Jordan. And I think it's, the new Steven Spielberg movie, and I just think it's wonderful that he has really taken the position of this being a positive thing. And he has taken the position really throughout the film that the key problem here is the secrecy. The key problem is that the people have the right to this information. They don't focus a lot on, this is a national security threat and we have to keep it secret. It's really about the people's right to the information. And although we don't see a lot about what happens after disclosure, you really get the sense from the film that this is a positive development for humanity. And so I love the fact that a lot of people will be exposed to this movie and will sort of hopefully be influenced by his perspective.
Yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised by that after seeing the film. I know one of the reasons why we wanted to have the conversation today was so, hopefully a good portion of the audience could have seen the movie and sort of been informed about it. From the previews, I was a little nervous that, oh no, is there going to be sort of the riots in the streets angle, and will that is that what's being pushed forward here? But it's really not. It really is a message of hope. They focus a lot on empathy in that film. I was really surprised the depth of education that Steven Spielberg has about this topic. The coverage of experiencer narratives I thought was incredible. The connection of this topic to consciousness he explores in depth. And I'm not giving anything away here. I'm certainly not going to spoil anything, but and the way that it's viewed positively is something that I think we really share.
Yeah, it's really great.
Could I add to that a little bit? There has been a little research done over the years, and the research that I've seen, it was quite a while ago, but makes the logical point that a great deal of the reaction impact will depend on the context. So let's assume for a moment that things continue as they have been, which is no aggression, no hostility, surveillance, whatever, a presence, an elusive presence, that will be received likely fairly with less concern and disruption, obviously, than if it was a Independence Day scenario. I mean, we're not seeing any aggression right now. We have concerns about the seeming interest in DOD facilities, but we're not seeing any kind of hostility. This has been going on for a long, long time. Chances are it'll probably continue more or less as it has, which isn't disrupting or threatening.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it also depends on what is actually said when the announcement is made, and also what kind of proof is presented, because they're going to have to offer something to really prove that this is not just, that this is the real deal. And they certainly provided that. And wait till you all see the movie, those who haven't. The moment where that proof is provided is really, really amazing. I love that part of the movie. So maybe we'll have something like that. Who knows? Anyway, shall we move on to the next question? Question is from Magnus Jiao, and I hope I sometimes have trouble pronouncing the name, so please forgive me for that. And the question is addressed to the whole group. What are the most significant elements of disclosure that has tangible effects on society, infrastructure, and how people will live their lives moving forward? I mean, this is very similar to the question we just got. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment.
Depends again on the specifics. So, do we actually have recovered material? If we do, how extensive is it? What success have we had reverse engineering it to provide solutions to problems that we face today? Technological solutions that would be part of the impact on infrastructure and day-to-day living that you're soon to be driving at, and markets and so forth. So there's a big question mark there, and some of our witnesses and people we talk to have seen some very extraordinary technology that appeared to be ours, or maybe derived from somebody else's, but some pretty far out stuff that's not in the public domain that are examples of how a technological revolution might be unleashed.
Leslie, I would add to that response that I think one of the things I talk about a lot in this subject is people really have the sense that they are being not being told the truth about a lot of things a lot of the time in this country. And that, to me, appears to have really taken a toll on our collective psyche as a culture, as a country. And I do believe that having truth and transparency around this subject and others will be a real positive and sort of a psychological salve that we can acknowledge and say, okay, this is great. We know the truth about this. Like that's a place that we can heal from and unite about. And fortunately, like Chris said, there's people at the Director of National Intelligence, the DIG, right? This is the Directors Initiative Group. They've been tasked with trying to pursue the truth about several of these topics that clearly the truth is being, at minimum, hidden. This would be the UAP topic. This would be COVID origins. This would be anomalous health incidents. So I'm at least thankful that this administration has keyed in on the need for transparency there. And importantly, that there's huge political capital. The response has been wildly positive in terms of what the political capital is there for transparency. And, and that example also shows the forces that are sort of up against us. Within the past few weeks, there was a whistleblower, a CIA whistleblower, who came out of the DIG saying that they were being unlawfully spied upon that people in that group and whistleblowers that were coming to them. So even this transparency effort that has the full backing and will of the President of the United States, according to this whistleblower, has been kneecapped by surveillance efforts by certain of the intelligence agencies. So I really hope that there will be, by that person coming forward, that we can close that off and continue to make progress, because it's scary to hear that that's happening even at the DNI, when of course the CIA is supposed to report to the DNI, not surveil them.
All right. Well, shall we go on to the next question? Okay. This is from our aliens, Sam Jones 2. Chris, this is for you. CIA and DOE have been noticeably absent from the first 2 tranches of files released. Is it safe to assume that they are refusing to follow the president's order? Are there ways to compel them to participate?
Great question. There's some wrinkles in this. As many of you may know, the classification authorities and process for the Department of Energy are entirely distinct from the Defense Department and the intelligence community. They have legislation that mandates their classification system in law. The other agencies are under an executive order. A little easier perhaps for the president to direct them to disregard classification markings than an organization like DOE, which has to meet the letter of the law mandated by Congress regarding classification issues. I'm not an attorney. I don't know if Hunt wants to pile on this, but I suspect that may be one of the reasons it's taking longer with DOE. They certainly have a lot of material to contribute. There have been lots and lots of sightings over decades and decades around DOE facilities, and they need to get on board. And they're within the administration. The president's guidance goes to them as well. I don't think they're in a position to refuse the president anyway. I think more likely it's bureaucratic and legal issues that are dragging it out and making it causing it to take longer there. CIA is a different story. They don't have that issue to point to justify any delays. So I'm surprised we're not seeing more there. The resistance may be stronger there in terms of getting material out. The classification issues may be a little more burdensome. But I think I'll be very surprised if they don't whip everybody into line in the weeks ahead.
The more interesting the documents, the longer it takes to get them. That's basically the bottom line. So we have to be patient. And there is a cat in somebody's space there. Jordan, did you want to add something to that, or should we go on to the next? Or Hunt? Should we go on?
Yeah, I mean, I might even go and be significantly more bullish on that response than Chris's answer. Our position today and into the future, until the United States Supreme Court, until a majority of the United States Supreme Court says otherwise, in my view, is that the President of the United States can declassify anything at any time for any reason, full stop. And Chris mentioned the atomic, Department of Energy, and the question, raises Department of Energy. We see this question a lot. And yes, while it's true that, the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and the subsequent amendments to that piece of legislation have established criteria for the classification and declassification of certain nuclear fissile material. And we don't have to get into it because it's kind of boring, but essentially one of the fascinating legal aspects of that is the overwhelming authority to classify and declassify information for national security reasons lies at the feet of the Article 2 executive. We call that the president. Sometimes, very rarely, Congress says, wait a minute, we're going to pass a law and say that this stuff is classified at its birth, right? So a statute like the one we're talking about now could say Congress deems this information is classified as soon as the information is born. And since we say it's classified in that manner, we will prescribe the way to declassify it. But even in this particular statute, the declassification process still involves members of the executive branch. It essentially leaves it up to a committee that makes a recommendation that is ultimately blessed off by the Secretary of the Energy and the Secretary of Defense. Now, there's nothing in the statute that says the president can't declassify this when he wants to, okay? But the Secretary of the Energy and the Secretary of Defense are cabinet members and serve at the pleasure of the president, okay? So the suggestion that those two individuals may go to the White House and say, you know, Mr. President, you want this out, but we don't want it because the statute says is silly. It's completely silly. And the president can do it anyways. And when he does, what's the remedy and who has one? You know, nobody does. And, you know, that's even further compounded by the Supreme Court essentially providing the Article 2 executive with flat out immunity for official acts that he takes while in office anyways. I mean, that happened in the last few years and it was subject of a lot of news. So we're pretty bullish on the legal side about the declassification by the president of really anything. I mean, there's almost no other statute that would prohibit that. There's a law that generally prohibits disclosing the identities of clandestine operatives in the field. You know, that's called the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. I'm not aware of that law ever even being used. But again, with respect to the president, it most clearly would not apply. So to answer the person's question, you know, DOE, CIA, all, you know, CIA director serves at the pleasure of the president. The president can hire and fire that individual at any time. In fact, the shuffling of seats in the intelligence community right now is the subject of a lot of news, as people are seeing. But anyways, we feel pretty strongly the president could do it. The wisdom of that decision and who is in the executive's ear to make it or not make it is a totally different story. And I don't you know, submit to be an expert on the wisdom of that decision or not, but can he do it? Yes, we feel very strongly he can.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Yeah, very encouraging too. I guess we'll go to the next question. For Chris, this question. In your 2022 Signal Exchange article, your source described a possible crash retrieval program structure and oversight apparatus, though they were ultimately denied direct access. 6 years later, how do you assess what that source reported? Why do you think establishing these facts remains difficult for Congress and oversight bodies?
Yeah, great question. I think we're all frustrated to some degree at the pace at which things have been moving ahead on disclosure. As Leslie pointed out at the beginning of the show, we have new information just as of yesterday from Dave Grusch that he has actually seen photographs of recovered craft and maybe recovered beings. So there's more and more reason to believe that this source was credible. This source, it took years to get his permission to print this. I was really kind of staggered when I received it initially that he would put this in a signal message. And he certainly had plausible access to this kind of information. So it's a credible message. Interesting also, by the way, that they talk about the craft landing, not crashing. So this would have been recovered in pristine shape, likely if that was the case. The information here, I'm very much a, show me the beef, show me the facts kind of guy. We need to get to the bottom of this one way or the other. It's taking longer than any of us would prefer. For example, it's frustrating that James Lukatsky says he put his head inside of a spaceship, but he won't come talk to Congress to validate that. And even, privately behind the scenes, there's some other sources out there that haven't wanted to because of the fears or concerns they have or whatever reason to come forward. So that's another problem. And maybe, there's just a lot of intimidation of people that work on these issues. But it has been difficult for Congress to get people to come forward who can provide specific information, who were in the program, who can say, I was there, I saw it, this is the name of the program, et cetera, et cetera. That has proven more difficult to achieve than many thought it would. And we're still, now with Dave's comments as of just yesterday, maybe we're on the threshold of a breakthrough like that. So I know we're working closely with members of Congress to try to get some of these other witnesses to come forward. I know there's been efforts to reach out to some of them, like Mr. Lukatsky, to see if he'd be willing to, at least in private, share some information. So my assessment remains similar to what it was. I at the very time that it happened, I was stunned and had no reason whatsoever to doubt what the source was saying. And I'd even heard similar information before from a couple of other sources with regard to the Air Force memo, for example. So it seemed credible to me at the time, and it still seems credible to me. It's not proof of anything, but it's credible, and we need to get to the bottom of it.
Do you know if Congress has taken any action on it, Chris? I mean, to try to follow up on some of what's in that document, or, for instance, the Air Force gatekeeper that's referenced, have they been able to take any action on it? Or do you think it's possible that they might be more likely to do that now, to maybe revisit it since so much has happened?
It's taking a long time, and there have been some missed opportunities. When I first provided that to a staffer at one of the oversight committees, he didn't share it with any of the other staff, or I was submitting it as a document for the record, assuming that it would be distributed and to include the chairman and vice chairman, and entered into the record as an official submission to the committee. And he didn't do that at all. I didn't share it with any of the other committee staff or anything. So that was one missed opportunity. And I have provided the name of the Air Force gatekeeper to the oversight committees years ago. And I also provided it to Aero, and don't know if they've done anything with it. So yeah, it's taking longer than one would hope. This is somebody who's not likely to come in voluntarily, and issuing subpoenas from Congress is not easily done. People may not realize that, but it is kind of viewed on the Hill as sort of a last resort sort of thing. They don't do that often. And typically it takes a committee majority vote. I think in the case of this one oversight committee, the chairman can do that unilaterally. But he's not on the subcommittee working the issue. I don't know if he feels the evidence is sufficiently compelling or not. But yeah, I'm a little surprised it's taking so long, a little frustrated, as many other people are, and hoping that soon we'll see some headway on that. But having said that, there's a lot of positive activity going on, including the administration seemingly renewed and reinforced effort to release UFO files.
Right. So who knows? Maybe they will revisit that. We just don't know.
And Leslie, I think it's important for the public to know that we've seen this happen multiple times. So we will come in, and this has happened to other people too. You come in, you have a meeting with, let's say, a staff of a committee or staff of a member of Congress. You provide information. Chris mentioned, one of the things, that person's name being provided. We provided that information and a significant amount of additional information to other individuals in other committee recently. And then you find out that that information didn't actually make it to the actual member of Congress, right? So it didn't go up in the committee or up in the staff and then to the member of Congress. Now, you can infer intent there if you want. You can infer, that they're trying to keep it from them. Maybe not. Political winds change, interest changes. But what we have learned, and what I want other folks to learn from this topic, is that simply just like giving a single name or a piece of paper or information, giving it once is not enough. You really need to be relentless with trying to make sure that that piece of information gets where it needs to go. Because that is hard work. But that's something our organization is pretty good at, is trying to make sure that, okay, this clearly didn't get to where it needs to go. We're going to try again and again and again. And recently, some of that information has gotten to the right place after a considerable amount of time. So it's yet another, I want anyone who's submitting information to know that just walking up and dropping something off isn't going to, it will probably stay there and go nowhere if you don't ensure that it gets pushed to the right places. So I think it's important for people to know that that is a phenomena independent of intent, that you really need to work hard there and be relentless.
Good point.
Could I comment briefly?
Oh, please, Chris. Yeah. I'm sorry, please.
Someone pointed out to me that Mr. Lukatsky, or maybe it's Dr. Lukatsky, is struggling with a major illness right now. So this may not be an ideal time, and maybe part of the reason he hasn't been more engaged lately. So, we wish him well and hope he has a full recovery.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Chris. I didn't know that. Next question. This is from Found My Toucan. What is the best evidence that would convince a skeptic of this phenomenon?
So one, I would familiarize myself with the history of this phenomenon. It is stunning when you delve into it, how many credible events have occurred involving multiple witnesses and or sensor information going all the way back to World War II. Around Los Alamos in 1950, they submitted a list of over 200 sightings just around that one facility, from scientists, Air Force officers, etc. And they were asking for assistance from Washington because they were so baffled and concerned by what was occurring. About a third of these were flying saucers. Well, that's one location in just 1 year. Nearby there at Farmington, New Mexico, there was a sighting, front page news again, of hundreds of objects flying over the town in a single day in broad daylight. So when you study the history of this phenomenon and all of the innumerable credible sightings, the cumulative effect is very powerful. That's one thing I would say that has helped to convince me that the phenomenon is very real. Secondly, you can focus in on specific cases like the Nimitz case, which is absolutely stunning. So our most advanced radar is detecting UAP dropping down from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet in under 2 seconds. And this is going on for days, and they're rebooting the radar, and they're just having a hard time believing what they're seeing. Finally, there's an intercept with two F-18s, and they see this white 50-foot long craft moving over the water in a way that no aircraft that we know of ever moves, like a ping pong ball, sort of bouncing off in a box, bouncing off the walls, and the water and the ocean surfaces roiling beneath it When one of the F-18s dives to engage it, it turns towards them, then shoots off 60 miles in a matter of about 3 seconds. Some extraordinary hypersonic speeds that were just absolutely shocking that any craft could withstand that much acceleration without a sonic boom, by the way, and without plasma from friction. And it hovered at a spot that they had logged into their computers earlier in the day as their rendezvous point for their exercises. Another F-18 comes up and he sees it doing things which no aircraft can do, and he gets an infrared video of it. And meanwhile, this is being tracked on the radar system of the USS Princeton the whole time, and sporadically on other systems on other platforms at the same time. So we have incidents like that and numerous others. That was one that was covered by the New York Times in 2017. There was also a video there from another incident involving the gimbal craft, which was stationary but rotating, and the pilots are sort of baffled by what this thing could be. It's holding its own against a wind that's over 100 knots or something. And then meanwhile, what you don't see, what you don't know, but the pilots are aware of, this thing was accompanied by a group of spheres that had cubes inside of them, 6 foot wide objects, round objects that were flying in formation together. When the F-18s approached, they scattered. With the F-15s less, they reassembled and continued to move with the gimbal craft. What kind of a sphere? How can a sphere fly without wings, without exhaust, without any visible means of propulsion? It's absolutely baffling, utterly baffling. No debunker has solved either of these cases. And the Defense Department admits they're both unsolved. And those are just 2 cases from one, near point in time that I was putting out there with video to support them. So there are lots of cases like that, and you have to ask yourself, the FLIR, the case with the Nimitz was 2004. We didn't have anything that could do that in 2004 and don't today. The lead pilot who intercepted the UAP said that thing's not from this earth when he was asked. That was his conclusion. And he's a Top Gun pilot and an engineer. So, if you're not impressed by that kind of data, then maybe I don't have anything to offer you. But I think there are enough cases like that that leave many of us thinking that this is now well documented and credible. In fact, the fact of UAP is acknowledged by our government, by the Defense Department. Your question really goes to, is it extraterrestrial, I think, is what you're asking, proof it's extraterrestrial. What many of us struggle is, we know that is not the former Soviet Union or long ago, or Russia today, or China. We can't imagine they have that kind of technology. We have no indication of that. We certainly don't. So then the question is, what could it be? Who's doing that? And that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think the other component of that too is all the people of very high credibility, such as the people in the movie The Age of Disclosure, who have come forward and can't provide documents, but have made very, very strong statements. And the question is, how, when they repeat them, when they're all saying the same thing, basically, are you going to take seriously what these highly credentialed people with high clearances who have been involved for decades, what they say? Is a skeptic just going to, write them off? I think that's another component that, to me, is very important, that I believe these people are telling the truth, and they would have no motivation not to, and they are in a position to know. So hopefully we will have more proof of them eventually. Is everything okay technologically? Okay. I'm sorry, Chris. I don't think you could just hear me. I keep forgetting to have to do this thing with my phone. I was just mentioning the importance of the highly credible intelligence insiders who have been involved with this for decades, who are also coming forward, like as they did in the Age of Disclosure movie. That are we going to just deny what they have to say, even if they can't offer us proof, so-called proof at the moment? They're a real source of validation for this, as far as I'm concerned.
Most of us have sources that are not coming forward, haven't come forward, who also seem credible. The Signal message was not the only message of that kind that I've received, or the only conversation. There's another gentleman who worked on foreign material in general, captured from other countries. And he was taken to a location one time to work on a component that he believes was of extraterrestrial origin. And he said it affected them in a strange way working on it. He was surprised by how little or how much time had actually passed. It seemed like, maybe because he was so engrossed by it, I don't know, but he said he was stunned when he saw the clock after he'd been working on this. He felt that was maybe another indication there was something about this that was very unusual. There are a couple of other sources, but we need at the end of the day definitive information, and it's not enough to have secondhand information. I heard this, I heard that. So that's where people are trying. That's where we're trying to take it.
And I think that's where the members of Congress are trying to take it, and so are people like David Grusch. And I'm pretty encouraged that I think we'll get there, but we'll see. All right. Should we move ahead to the next question here? Okay. This is a fairly long one by Pass Your Own Butter. It's just for Chris. Chris, you have had senior national security positions. You have held senior national security positions and now publicly advocate for UAP disclosure. That gives your statements weight, but it also raises a difficult question. If people with far less status, protection, and institutional knowledge are facing retaliation for trying to bring UAP information through lawful channels, what obligation do senior formal officials like yourself have to publicly identify the institutional failure that allows this? Why should lower-level witnesses trust the process if even prominent disclosure advocates acknowledge that the process does not reliably protect them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've put a policy memo on our website discussing this issue, and we have legal resources available to anyone who seeks to be a whistleblower. We're happy to advise them on their rights and options under the law. We have a confidential email address that goes to one of our attorneys, and I'll put that out there: FoundationSecure@proton.me. One of the things we point out in our policy memo is that nobody has ever been prosecuted for providing classified information to Congress in an appropriate setting. So I think some of the fears and concerns are overblown in some cases. Most non-disclosure agreements, if you read them carefully, actually have a segment that says Congress this isn't binding on Congress, that you can't tell anybody, but if you're brought before Congress, you can speak to Congress about it. So I've brought multiple people to the Hill over the years, names that and to Arrow. Brought Eric Davis, for example, back in 2019 to the Hill, who to meet with staff of two committees to tell him some of the extraordinary things that he has to say. And I don't think Eric has suffered any retribution of any kind for that. And I've done that with a number of people, and I've not suffered any retribution myself, although I was investigated by the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. My clearance was flagged for a while in the system. I had trouble getting into a couple meetings for a little while. So administrative responses are something that is still an issue and a risk for potential whistleblowers, and we recognize that. There is some legislation being put forward, which we support, to try to provide additional protections, lawful protections for potential whistleblowers. So it's a bit of a complex legal issue, but my personal experience and most of the people I work with has been that they've not had a problem. In fact, I would say once you connect with Capitol Hill and the committees and the members, if anything, you're safer. They're much less likely to want to take you on or mistreat you in your organization because that'll instantly come to the attention of Congress, and that's not a good thing. There's nobody in the executive branch who wants to be on the wrong side of Congress or be under their magnifying glass. So I think you're actually, in some cases, probably safer once you actually do engage with the Congress. However, different people have different experiences and come from different organizations and face different risks. It's hard to cover all of that. I think we could also, one of the concerns I've heard is a financial concern that is addressed in the legislation. And sometimes people need things like travel money, and that's something we might be able to help with in some individual cases. And Hunt, I don't know if you want to comment on this. You're probably, it's a very complicated legal situation.
Yeah, I mean, Chris is right. We, to be clear, we could spend this whole discussion from that question, Leslie. Let me try and put a thermometer into the frustration that I sense from that question, which is, why can't they just come out and do it and say it, and why can't we just get this over with, versus they can't do it at all because all these things will happen to them. That's really like a very significant discussion that we have on the legal side. We want to be clear that providing information to Congress, we are very confident and have a lot of data and citation and authority to back that up, that is a correct and appropriate method for individuals with information. And I will just, that's not my legal theory. That's not like a policy memo. Like, Title 5, okay, Chapter 72 of the United States Code says verbatim, the right of employees individually or collectively to petition Congress or a member of Congress, or to furnish information to either House of Congress or to a committee or member thereof, may not be interfered with or denied. Okay, that's black and white federal law. That's not a legal theory. That wasn't a policy memo I read. That's the starting point for this idea. Okay, and so let's be clear though. That's the appropriate method and avenue for this information to flow. If someone chooses to go out and simply provide information to the public that they have access to, that is a totally different scenario, right? And there are considerable legal implications in that scenario that people need to be concerned with. But in terms of providing it to the members of Congress appropriately, we feel very strongly and have a lot of authority that is the appropriate method. Now, here's a frustration, another frustration. Well, once you give the info to these members of Congress, they don't do anything with it and they sit on it. Now, that's a real frustration. I think I could name a few individuals specifically that would echo that frustration. And unfortunately, with respect to that, there's not much we can do once we give it to Congress. We have to have the operate under the assumption that when they do get this information, that they do the right things, they pass the right laws, like any other subject. So I completely understand the frustration about column B, which is what comes after Congress has provided this information. I think we are seeing, to the previous question, I think we are seeing a lot of activity on the Hill. I think, frankly, one of the reasons our organization is so keyed in and focused on some members of Congress is for that very reason, that once they get this information, what are they supposed to do about it? And so I know that doesn't talk a lot about protecting folks individually. That's another subject, but we really also feel strongly that if folks take the avenue that Chris has suggested, and that frankly many of the prominent names that people know about this subject have taken, that's the way to do it. Now, this administrative reprisal stuff that keeps popping up, and essentially we use the word retaliation, but that can come in a lot of forms, right? If you're retaliated by a bill of indictment being asserted against you and a criminal charge, well, we can adjudicate that, right? There's a process for that, and we know all the answers to that process. What's way cloudier and murkier is when the federal government itself, from an administrative standpoint, controls these people's livelihoods, right? When and this happens in the private sector. It's not just the federal government. I mean, it happens, in the private employment sector all the time. You go to the boss, you make an HR complaint, and then next you see your reviews are all of a sudden, going in the tank, and a case is being made against you that you're not a good employee and you get fired. Yeah, that's basically what we're talking about here, but on the administrative level. Those protections are inadequate as we see. The law protecting that type of retaliation is inadequate, and Congress needs to address it. We think, again, if you are a whistleblower and you have information that you feel Congress needs to get, you have a legal right to provide it. You should discuss with an attorney first what the safest way to do that for your individual case is. And we can provide that. Our organization can provide that. It doesn't have to. You can find your own counsel to do that. You should have a discussion with a legal professional that can best protect you, but also get the information that you are lawfully allowed to provide to Congress. And so again, every case is different. There is no silver bullet for this topic, because every individual comes from a different place. Like the statute I just read says employees of the federal government. What if you're a private contractor, right? Different scenario, different avenue. What if you're a member of the armed services, subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Now we've got a totally different scenario, right? That person, very different aspects of what they have to consider. So that's why I really urge, you need to have like a one-on-one discussion about your own situation before going, anywhere else, and then tailor your specific case to how the best way to get the information to Congress and protect you, right? Because that's what we're supposed to do at the end of the day. So that's what I would kind of have to say about that. I know this one is a big elephant to shoot, and we could do it all day. So there you go.
Well, I know we have one more question, if you can stay, Hunt, that has to do with amnesty. Maybe we could just put that question up on the screen right now, and we'll address that one. This is from This is from Wackamex. I'm Wackamex, sorry about that. So the question is, do you support amnesty for crimes committed inside the program?
Yeah, I'll briefly talk on that and then let the other guys, chime in from a policy perspective. I mean, I think with respect to the amnesty issue, I believe that to the extent a crime is simply revealing the information, right? So we're talking about like unauthorized disclosure statutes that make it a crime or a felony to say X, Y, and Z. Certainly to that extent, yes, I would support it. I personally would not support amnesty for individuals who have committed violent crimes. And I would hope that nobody else would. There's no legal justification under any law to commit violent crimes absent exigencies recognized by federal law. And so I would see no reason why we would need to do that. And further, that concept to me is confusing, because the whole point of this is transparency and truth, and something has been going on that has been kept from you, I don't see why we would make an exception, for serious crimes, except crimes of privacy and information. I agree, but so no, I don't think that would help this topic personally. If we all of a sudden wrote a blank check for violent crimes that other Americans in their everyday lives have to suffer, criminal action and jail time for. So no, I think we can do this without giving serious criminal activity a pass. So there you go.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I would jump in to say I get worried about the conversations around amnesty in the UAP community, because it's almost taken on this sort of political, that word is taken on like a political association, and people are sort of reflexively taking a hard stance for it or against it. And what I think the case that Hunt is trying to make here is that instead of just reflexively saying, oh, they shall go to prison, or we should give everyone amnesty for everything so we can learn the truth, we really need to do more thinking and more problem solving. Or amnesty of what, or from what, and to whom, and how that would be operationalized. I'm at least made somewhat more sanguine by the talk of a period, like for this executive order for the president, if he were to say, you have 60 days to disclose this information that you've been working on in order to receive immunity or amnesty, whatever the appropriate legal word is there. And that puts a clock on it, that provides an incentive. They can say, here's the information we're looking for. And to Hunt's point, like actually giving amnesty for those specific actions, but we don't think that that's going to include violent crimes against whistleblowers, human trafficking, etc. So we'll just really push that there be a more thinking and problem solving around this, and that we can have a sophisticated response, and not as a topic or as a community buy into this sort of like reflexive politicalization of words like that.
Right. I wanted to just acknowledge that Hunt had to depart, and I wanted to thank Hunt very much for joining us. And his comments were extremely helpful, but he had to go off. So we'll stick around with you two guys. Let's go to the next question. Okay, this question is for Chris from Toxic Toy. Chris Mellon and the Disclosure Foundation members, or it's for Chris and the Disclosure Foundation. So that's Chris and Jordan. So David Grusch has stated, quotes, there is a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral, end of quotes. Do you think there is evidence of this campaign? And if so, does it extend into social media, including Reddit, today?
Dave and I haven't spoken for a while, and I'm not sure what he's referring to there exactly. It was clear to me historically that the government was indeed engaging not only in disinformation, but illegal covert action against the American people. There was a period when there was recruiting of U.S. citizens at UFO organizations. There was disinformation put out that was intended to discredit some of these people and researchers, various things to try to delegitimize the UFO movement and anyone who is having an impact in that area. There's some great examples of this in one of the early researchers on the crash retrieval issue. And some amazing things happened to him. Leslie, you know his name. I'm trying to think of his name right now. He wrote, but anyway, he went to a MUFON event, for example, and he had been warned not to go. And just as he started to speak, these two police officers came up and tackled him and dragged him off stage and took him upstairs to a hotel room. And it wasn't his room. And they had this whole thing set up so that he wouldn't be able to give his speech. I mean, that's the degree of intervention that was going on at times. And he also received letters later from people trying to sell him on sightings they'd had and things, which turned out to be bogus efforts by OSI, I believe, to discredit him. So I've seen evidence of that. More recently, for me, it's not as clear, but I don't doubt that this kind of thing is going on to some degree. We've had the Princeton radar disappeared. Nobody knows where it is. We had the logbooks from the USS Princeton disappear. Nobody knows where they are. So there are things like that that seem to be examples of a hidden hand that's working behind the scenes. We have some people that are debunkers, and you wonder, is anyone paying them? They seem to be working like all day, every day on this, like 9 to 5. So yeah, there are some questions that come up about that in my mind as well. But I don't have any clear evidence of that, although I suspect there may well still be some of that going on.
I mean, Chris, another example of that we potentially could discuss is the Wall Street Journal article that was written a few months ago, in which we provided we sent a letter to the editor pointing out what are factual errors, and then there's also some, I think, confabulation of points there, some connections that were made that aren't real connections. We published this. We did not get them to issue any retractions for this article, but and so as a result, we made this letter to the editor that we sent public. We sent it from our organization. Chris, you had signed it. And Leslie, I think you're aware of this too. And I'm happy to name names of the paper and the Wall Street Journal and the authors if we want to go that route. I have no reservations about that. But the point is that their own sources in this article said that they had gotten it factually wrong and requested changes, and the authors still refused to change it or issue a retraction. This is not, this is not like UFO Twitter or whatever. This is the Wall Street Journal, refused to do this when their own sources were complaining about the conclusions made and explicitly requesting retractions and changes. So I want to point that out, that's what sticks out to me when David Grusch says things like that. That's how we've encountered it on our end. There may be much more sophisticated plans afoot there, but that it's really jarring when you make clear logical points like this to an editor and it is just categorically ignored and denied. And
Right.
Leslie, I'm curious if you want to comment on that. I think you read the letter that we sent and tried to shine a bright light on what was happening here, and we're really disappointed in the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting from my perspective is that one of the people that was interviewed for that story was my colleague, Ralph Blumenthal, who we always do all our stories together. And it was something to do with the 2017 story, because I think I did not choose to speak with that reporter, but Ralph did. And he literally got something 100% wrong, just like you're saying, right? It was just factually inaccurate and attributed it to Ralph. So he directly emailed the reporter about it. He didn't just go to the editor. He directly emailed that reporter and said, "Are you going to make a correction?" And the guy didn't deny that it was inaccurate. He said, that's up to my editors. It's up to the editors. And that was the end of the conversation. So I hold the reporter accountable for the errors. And I don't know what that's about. I can't imagine that if a reporter, if the story we did for the New York Times, if we had gone back to our editor and said, "We made an error, please issue a correction," they would do it in a flash. So I don't know what that reporter, whether he's being honest or not. But I mean, that's the kind of pressure that was put out after that story. It's similar to what you're describing, Jordan, and they never issued any corrections, which is what papers generally are willing to do and do when they make mistakes. So why in this one story are they not willing to do that? That's a good question.
Yeah. And we need to shine a bright light on that behavior and call it out when we see it. You know, I would hope that Ralph would be willing to make that public to prove the case at some point, but I understand if he has reservations there, but it doesn't change the ultimate outcome. It'll be interesting to see if, you know, if that author or that pair of authors continues to try to cover this subject, just given what seems to be real journalistic malfeasance.
Exactly. And there was a second story. I mean, as I recall, I think they did 2 stories. And the second one wasn't any better, as I recall. But yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think, you know, what Chris highlighted about the kinds of disinformation campaigns that we've seen throughout history, I just feel like perhaps they were more intense in the past and more kind of blatant and more hostile and more, you know, because then people didn't have the awareness that they have now of these kinds of things. So they could get away with more in the past, it seems to me. But I think it still goes on. It's just more subtle now.
I would note the report on the history. Congress asked for a report on the history of UAP of the U.S. government. And I wrote a 14,000-word response to that, pointing out dozens of errors. And their conclusion was that people had been seeing and reporting stealth aircraft, was sort of what we were supposed to believe, and that there was a program that was sort of a joke in the Pentagon or something to show people pictures of UFOs, and then, I guess sort of just for yucks or something, for security officers. And there was a training program or something, and they claimed that this is what people have been seeing, and this is where this stuff's coming from. And it was pretty outrageous that they would submit a report that was so far off base and so incredibly imbalanced and misleading. So I think there's still, I think I would view that as another example of really misleading the public.
And that was the Arrow report that you're referring to, I believe, that history report. And I would echo what you're saying, Chris. I mean, I would encourage everyone to look at that report Chris did. I remember when you published that, and it was so complete and so excellent in addressing the errors that they made. And there were so many errors. That's why it took so many words for you to do it, or so many pages. So it was just astonishing. It was so blatantly erroneous what they put out. You don't know how they could ever have come up with that kind of information, or disinformation, but they managed to do it.
And it rhymes with history, right? It rhymes with, even in the, on Tuesday, David Grusch made reference to the 1971 Australian intelligence document, right? And again, highly recommend that everyone interested in this subject go and read that. And even in that document, other people have written about this, but even in that document, they describe specifically how the conclusions of the Condon report specifically were exactly the opposite of what the data in the Condon report actually said, right? So you just issue an unclassified summary that says that there's nothing to see here, but when you look at the actual report, it has the details that support that there's really a there. That's what the story reminds me of, and we have these instances throughout history of this happening.
Right, and that's the thing with the Condon report, because it was 1,000 pages. So they were able to issue their 1.5-page summary, and that's what the media used to report on the report. They didn't take the time to read 1,000 pages. They just took the word of the people who were issuing that statement. So yeah, I mean, this has been going on, and you're talking about 1969, 1970 now. So this has been going on forever. So anyway, we could, like Hunt said earlier, we could spend a whole program just talking about these very examples. But I think that we've addressed the question pretty well, unless anybody wants to add anything else. Otherwise, we can just go on to the next question. Chris, are you concerned that UFO influencers are being fed fearful narratives, specifically regarding demons and abductions, to diminish the probability of global open contact?
I wish I knew who was doing that and why. I've read a bit about this, and I need to look into this a little more deeply. Where these briefings are coming from. Is there an official connection to this? Or is this somebody who's got influence in that community, who's preaching this alternative viewpoint or something? I don't think it's being done with the intent, with a long-term strategic intent for preventing developments at the highest levels. I think it's probably much more tactical. Somebody in that community is reacting to the news. We know this is going to be the UAP issue, challenging and upsetting to some people and to some religious people. Not necessarily most or a great many, but it will be to some. And I think this may be an example of that. And for some people, if you don't believe in evolution, say, and you have a very different perspective than the average person these days, this kind of narrative might fit your worldview much more comfortably than the idea of aliens or extraterrestrials, for example. So I'm not sure who's behind it, frankly. I think it was more likely somebody taking their own initiative, perhaps with a few others, to espouse that. And I don't know what their motives were.
Thank you for answering that. Yeah. Let's go on to the next question. Well, this one is directed to me. Okay, is there a role for the public to... It's from Big Ad's Daddy. Thank you for the question. Is there a role for the public to play in advocating for disclosure? Considering the topic's history as conspiracy theory, what advice do you have for the public on determining what data is credible? Well, that's a big question. I believe, of course, there is a role for the public to play, and you're pointing to the fact that education is important to become so that you understand what's going on. But then, of course, I think a major role the public can play is to contact your members of Congress and let them know that you care about this and that you want them to take action on the transparency of this issue and to join with other members who are already doing that. And I think in terms of, judging the credibility, it's very difficult when you go out on the internet, if you've never been involved with this before and you want to know what's going on, and all the stuff that's out there can be overwhelming. And I think what's really important is to be very discerning about who you're willing to listen to. Check it out with people who are well informed and get their input on, who the best sources are of information. Certainly anybody at the Disclosure Foundation, could help with that. People who are well established in the field. And I think it's important that when you are listening to someone, you pay attention to what their credentials are. So somebody like David Grusch, who has not been able to come up with hardcore data proof, documents and photographs the way everyone wants because they're classified. That's the only reason. He's very, very credible and very hard to not take seriously because of the credentials that he has and because of his history and because of the respect he has within the intelligence community. And, the story that Ralph and I wrote about him in 2023 in the debrief outlines all of that. And I think you can research various experts who are out there and see whether you believe that they are people who would be in the know on something like this. And just, be careful who you listen to. I think that the Age of Disclosure documentary is a good source for people to get in tune with who some of the government officials are that are playing a major role in that. I think you can trust those people. And, just be careful to pay attention to who the people are and how respected are they, who is listening to them, and just go to the right authorities and you can figure it out. And there's so much information out there and so much that's accessible, even just through podcasts, that I think you can come up to speed pretty quickly because it's all there. I don't know if you guys would add anything else to that, but in my journalism, that's what I do, and I check out the credentials of everybody involved that I'm going to bring into a story. And this is the way you do it. You talk to other people, you look at their background, you vet them, and you make a decision whether you're going to accept what they say or not. And I think everybody has to go through that process. But I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
I think you covered it pretty well, Leslie.
All right. So I hope that was helpful. Let's go to another question. And this question is from Scalebirds on our UFOs and is addressed to all of us. Do you think there could be a Sputnik moment where another nation besides the US suddenly reveals UAP tech capabilities in the field? Would disclosure by the US before that happens help prevent a catastrophic Sputnik, in quotes, Sputnik, or Manhattan Project-like event, where one state actor uses the technology by surprise?
That's an interesting argument. Disclosure to preempt somebody else's disclosure. And it is conceivable, the scenario you talk about. There are quite a few reports and indications that, for example, Russia may have recovered something, and there's certainly claims that they've actually had some headway reverse engineering it. So it's hard to assess those claims. Anything that comes from Russia, human sources, et cetera, is always a little suspect. They're big proponents of disinformation, but that's entirely conceivable. And that is an argument that, among others, some have used to further justify why we should move ahead quickly with disclosure. It's also possible that some event could happen unilaterally where some UAP show up over New York City or something, like reportedly what's happened over a football game in Italy in the 50s, where 10,000 plus people all saw a UFO at once. If it had lingered over downtown today, with social media and everything, it would be an astonishing event. It would be have enormous power, and there's an argument for a number of reasons to try to get ahead of these various scenarios. We can certainly, to the degree that we do have concerns, openness about that is what we need to do to get mobilized to address those concerns. So there are all kinds of good reasons, I think, for disclosure, and that's yet another.
Do you think we have a lot of intelligence monitoring of let's say the Chinese, Chris, like to what extent they are back engineering or where they're at with this issue in terms of their own programs? Is there any way that our government can monitor that, or is it completely unknown to us?
Sure. Now, we spend our government spends a lot of time and effort monitoring the technological developments in those countries across the board, and their aerospace programs are up near the top of the list. So there's a lot of collection directed on those targets, and that's one of the reasons that I'm confident, for example, that in 2004 that Tic Tac was not Russian or Chinese. I think we'd very well have some indication if they were that far along on something really radical, because we do have pretty good information, and both sides are playing that game. But the aerospace industry also has all these big conferences where people bring their jets in, including all these different countries, and the pilots meet and they share information, and there's some contact that goes on, and for quite a bit of information that comes over overtly about what different countries are working on and through the corporations and so forth, in addition to what we collect unilaterally. So I think when we put all the pieces together, we have a pretty good picture generally of what's going on.
Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, it's a wild world we live in. We never know. All right, we'll go on to the next question, please. And this is from Like Bright Shirts and UFOB, Reddit UFOB. What can the international community do to help drive this forward? We're all on this planet together, and it's far beyond U.S. borders only, the phenomenon. This is a species-wide issue. How can non-Americans help beyond advocacy to our own governments? Are there bodies that are likely to bring national leaders together, like the G8 or G20 or the United Nations on this topic?
It's an interesting question because I think it underscores Chris's prior response, which is connected to the prior question. You know, this is a reason why it's an opportunity for American leadership and American exceptionalism, I think. If we are able to be a leader on this topic, then we're able to take that leadership into like the international sphere and bring others along with us. I think that's one reasonable way to look at this. I think another is, to the extent in the international community, to the extent you live in a democratic country, it's the same answer. It's contact your members of parliament or your congressional representatives to try and express your interest in this topic and start your own organizations, whether they're grassroots or nonprofit or what have you, to try and build political capital. I think that's one thing that several of the groups focused on this work in the United States have been able to really successfully do, is to build political capital around this topic, and that's having impact. So I think we are, and there's other opportunities for international organizations to bring this topic to the United Nations, for example, and to other international events to try to educate across the world, because it certainly is not, as Chris mentioned, this is not a only an American issue with respect to all of the ways that it impacts us, from national security to religion, etc. It's a worldwide phenomena. So, Chris, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add there.
Yeah. One thing you might consider is volunteering for a UAP organization. For example, the Galileo Project is always looking for people with technical skills, and it's a very international team. It's not just Americans. There are other organizations with other needs that are on the internet, and that might be something that might be of interest for people who want to get involved. The UN, there are a couple of efforts underway to try to get the UN Aviation Authority, I think, is where the target is going to be, to try to get them to adopt a reporting mechanism. I know it's hard in many of these countries, much harder than it was here, to engage with the legislative branch when you're in a parliamentary democracy. We were fortunate in that regard because of the great independence and power that our legislative committees have, and their ability to demand information, and their control over the budget, and ability to really have an impact. Much harder in a parliamentary system. We've engaged with, I've spoken with the Japanese Legislative Caucus a couple of times, and engaged with the French to some degree. And we have a gentleman in Europe who's helping us engage with countries abroad. So I think there's a lot that can happen there that would help. And I know that there's not the same degree of interest right now in Europe, for example, and many other countries. But this process of growing up organically from the bottom, of people like yourself who are interested, becoming active, eventually, if you get involved, I'm sure you'll end up rallying some support.
And I just want to add too the role of the Brazil. Brazil is very involved with this issue, and all of South America. I spent a lot of time some years ago in South America dealing with some of the government agencies there, and the people there are way more accepting of the reality of this. And I think that's a very rich environment. And of course, Brazil, you have the Varginha case, which has been coming up more recently in the news. Also, Dave Grusch mentioned this on Fox last night, that the former Minister of Defense from that country, from Brazil, who is now running for president, has actually come out and said publicly that the Varginha case is real. It did happen, as has been reported. So this is a really big step. So I think there is a lot of international activity here. I wish there was some way it could all be coordinated better. Maybe someday we'll have an international body that with representatives from each country that can work on this together. But yeah, I think it's a really, really important question, and for us to realize in America that this is not just about America. Yeah. And we're running out of time here, but we have time for maybe a couple more questions before we end. So let's go to the next one. And this is from Toxic Toy. And it's being asked on behalf of the Pavel Ibarra and the Psychoactivo podcast. And the question is, it was recently revealed that the name of the person you mentioned last year who passed away right before he was supposed to meet with Lou Elizondo and yourself. His name was Kevin Childress, and he used to work for the Department of Energy. His obituary has a paragraph discussing how deeply involved he was in researching UFOs. Is there any type of insight you might be able to share about what Kevin's potential role in this topic was?
Well, a couple of things that are wrong there. It wasn't Childress. I don't know Kevin, so I don't know who revealed that, but whoever revealed it got it wrong. It was a gentleman named Jim Ryder from Lockheed Martin. So just to clarify that. And it wasn't a meeting for Lou and I, actually. I was just meeting him one-off. And Jim was, I guess, probably early 70s and sadly passed away. I don't have any reason to believe there was foul play other than the coincidence in timing was suspicious. I couldn't help, in this world, you can't help but wonder sometimes. It's hard to know to what degree paranoia is justified, but it certainly, this had been the result of a long effort by my part to get in touch with him and set this up. And I was very sorry to hear what happened, and also couldn't help but go to that place and wonder a little bit if there could have been some foul play, but there's no specific indication of that.
Okay. Thank you for the answer, Chris, and for the clarification. Let's try another question here. And this is from Acceptable Panic 6518. Here is my question for Chris. Many scholars of the history of ideas, including figures like Jacques Vallée or even works from before the modern era, suggest that UAPs and anomalous experiences share a consistent morphology with what in the past was described through symbolic, esoteric, or mystical systems. Since the phenomenon seems to adapt culturally, how does the Foundation ensure that our current analytical framework, focused purely on technology and national security, is not ignoring fundamental data by deliberately excluding historical frameworks that already described these anomalies centuries ago?
I'm happy to provide a very specific answer to that. Specifically, one of the ways that our foundation is trying to address that is by having people with a religious or philosophical academic background talk about the topic. So whether it's, Dr. Carlos Eyre from Yale, who I mentioned previously, and there are others in this topic that really have a deep understanding of the historical, religious and philosophical intersections of the topic. I think the answer is engaging those people. And that's why, for example, for our event on June 25th, sure, we talk about science, technology, we talk about national security, but we're well aware that that's not where the conversation should stop, that we should talk about the things I think that were mentioned in the question. So that, for me, where I sit, that's entirely fair and relevant, and something we make sure that we don't want to lose track of.
Right. Before we go to Chris, I would just add both Diana Pasulka and Jeffrey Kreipel are excellent sources of, probably the question already knows this, but of this kind of information. And I think it's a great question, and that we just want to try to integrate that aspect of it into the dialogue as much as we can. And so I commend you for incorporating that in the forum. But those two writers have really dealt with this topic. And I love the book They Flew. It's one of my all-time favorite books. So Chris, you might probably have something to add to this.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. We don't exclude anything or any frameworks. And I know Diana a little bit from conferences, and we all read those books. I'm very close friends with Jacques Vallée, and a big fan, and others. So I think they've got a lot to say. But there's something that's important, perhaps, to understand from the standpoint of how we got to where we are today. And that is, I could not have, I was facing a Congress at a time when this was still a laughing matter. It had no credibility. You couldn't talk about it. It was not in the mainstream press. And the only way to be able to get traction, to begin to move this discussion forward, and to force the Defense Department to cough up data it didn't want to cough up, was to play the national security card, period. Not that I had a big trouble. I mean, that was the only game, that was the only way these people could possibly justify the political risk in engaging on this issue. And there were very legitimate reasons for them to do so. We provided those reasons, and they saw the logic of that, and they saw the data. And then they did begin to move forward and stop treating it like a laughing matter. But if we hadn't emphasized that and taken that approach, we wouldn't be having this discussion at all today.
And that's so true, Chris. Just to reflect, when I started reporting on this literally in the year 2000, when the taboo just ruled everything, it was like another world from post-2017. That was what I had to do. I had to really focus on, I remember, it was not just national security, because we didn't know a lot then, but aviation safety was a really big one at that. And it still is. It's still very important. But the second story I did was about aviation safety based on a report by Richard Haynes from NASA. And it was all about, yes, here's an umbrella that people can go under and feel that it's okay to care about this issue, because national security aviation safety is obviously important to everyone. So yeah, they have to have that kind of a safety capsule around them in order to address it. And now it's become more national security. But I think everybody out there is very excited for other aspects of this to be able to become more integrated into the mainstream narrative. And I think too, from talking to members of Congress, they are more aware of these other aspects than any of us realize. So it's just a matter of what goes out publicly has to be so carefully orchestrated. I'm sure you would agree with that. Yeah.
I think if I had gone to this, Commerce Committee or something that has jurisdiction, or committee of jurisdiction over space, they would have laughed me out of the room. They wouldn't have given me the time of day. So we engaged where we could, how best I think we could. And it doesn't exclude anything. But it has caused the issue to be, to some degree, that aspect of it to be emphasized for sure. But that's, I think, inevitable in these circumstances.
Right. And it's particularly difficult for the experiencers out there and others who are so much more aware of the complexity that this issue, that the phenomenon involves. So that everyone needs to understand, when you're going out publicly with it, you have to be very careful to only put out information that will be productive at that particular time. And that's what we're doing. And gradually it's going to shift more and more. And I think the movie Disclosure Day is going to help with that too. It really deals with the other aspects of this, as Jordan mentioned. So we're moving, but we have to be careful how we move so we don't alienate anybody. No pun intended.
Pretty full plate right now with what we have with the national security aspect and angle, but we're making headway. And I think that's really the bottom line. As long as we keep making progress, I don't think we need to change our serve. If we stop, when we stop making progress, then we got to reevaluate.
Exactly. All right. So I think we have one or two more questions that are fairly quick, and then we'll wrap up. Let's see what we've got next. This is from Stupidize Me. All right. I hope it's not a stupid question. I doubt it is. Okay. What is your advice for people who think they've witnessed and photographed a UAP? Who should they contact? What should they do or not do?
Well, I would hope they would try to photograph what they see and report it and share it. There are a lot of organizations that they can do that with. MUFON and NUFORC are probably the two that are most often the recipients of photographs and reports. And you can just do that right online from your home on your computer. So that's easy. And surprisingly few people do that. There are hundreds of thousands of reports that they've received, literally hundreds of thousands. And yet, when I speak to a group about UFOs, and if I say, how many of you have seen a UFO, put up your hand, and a bunch of hands go up, then I say, how many of you reported it? Leave your hands up, and almost all the hands go down. Almost nobody reports, maybe 1 in 10 people. So that does help, and that's what I would encourage people to try to do.
I would make the point that, another organization that's doing amazing work in that space is Americans for Safe Aerospace, Ryan Graves' organization, connecting to the prior question or prior conversation about airspace safety and how critically important that is. Americans for Safe Aerospace has taken in a significant amount of sightings, information, some of which was released via the Pursue data drops, right? Some of their sightings that came in through ASA made it into those data releases. So I think that shows you that, these organizations are working, and that people are taking, whether they're commercial pilots, private citizens in New Jersey with, car-sized, quote, drones floating over their houses, take the picture, absolutely get the information to the right local municipal authorities, contact the FBI if you think you need to, and then contact certainly these organizations dedicated to UAP and aerospace safety like Americans for Safe Aerospace.
Absolutely. The more
Graves is doing a
reports
great
we have,
job over there.
Yep. And the more reports we have, the better. So everybody, don't hesitate to report your sighting and your photographs if you have them at all. It all makes a big difference. Is there any fictional work that you both feel, any nonfiction or science fiction works that you feel best describes the phenomenon, of what the phenomenon actually really is, that you would personally, your personal favorites, or that you might want to recommend to people?
One of the recent books that I liked a lot was Robert Powell's book. And Robert runs the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and he's written a book, What Science Knows and Doesn't Know About UAP. And I think for someone who is new to the subject, that's a very good primer. Well stated. Leslie, there's your book, is a very good primer for people coming to the subject.
Except it's not nonfiction. It's not nonfiction, Chris. We got to make that clear. It's not sci-fi either.
You're looking for sci-fi only?
Well, I don't know. That was sort of the gist of the question. Just any non-fictional, any fictional works. People are always curious about fictional works that speak to the truth of the topic.
Oh,
it could be films
great.
Or books or whatever. I mean, it sounds like Jordan has something to say here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Chris, while you're thinking about that, Leslie, I have an answer for. It's kind of a cheeky answer. It's a nonfiction book. So I sometimes, when people ask me what my favorite UFO book is, sort of one cheeky response I have is that there's a book by investigative journalist Tom O'Neill. He wrote a book called Chaos about the history of the CIA, Charles Manson, the Manson murders, and MK Ultra. And what I find fascinating about that book is that he does such a wonderful job of painting the pictures of these, of the unseen hand, and these sort of cloaked power structures that he ends up tripping over as he's trying to like just get to the facts of what happened here in and around these different like intelligence programs, how they intersected with the criminal trial of Manson. So that's one. I would say that's sort of an answer by analogy that I really enjoyed reading that book and thinking about it through the lens of UAP and realizing how much is applicable here in terms of explaining the sort of hidden and subterranean power structures at play.
I don't have a science fiction book I've read that really explains the current situation well. I think Tom DeLonge's Secret Machines is one that may come close, and I'm surprised it hasn't been made into a feature film. That you can just see the movie leaping out of the pages when you read it, and it would be very, very current, very appropriate. People would, I think it could do really well, actually. My favorite sci-fi book, which is much more extensive and visionary and beyond anything we could see today, though, is Hyperion. One of my favorite books of all time. And it's powerful and multidimensional and just an incredible work of science fiction.
And, Leslie, maybe this is a good time to sort of add in you and I were having a short conversation about the reaction to the Steven Spielberg movie. And I think as a work of fiction, I think this film could do a lot of heavy lifting for us in this topic, in the same way that I think now we have this. He does such a good job of painting the picture of the sort of the military subcontractors in control of the information, how these things have potentially been hidden, what it would take to get them out, that we now have this like a real cultural reference point in popular culture that we didn't have before, that we can really refer to this and say, oh, hey, remember, Disclosure Day, it's like this in some ways, not in others, simplified, but the core narrative thrust is super helpful, I think, for people understanding how this has been kept secret for so long. And so I think owing Steven Spielberg a debt of gratitude in that way for helping provide that cultural reference point that can do some heavy lifting for us as we want to educate the public about this.
I agree. And one of my all-time favorites is, of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, another Spielberg movie that was literally made 50 years ago. So it's really interesting to see. And what he has said is that when he made that movie, he was hoping that someday what he was making in that movie would be shown to be real. And now he is saying it is real. He's learned that, and now he's making another movie that kind of caps that off. I had the privilege of actually meeting Stephen Friday night right before the screening, and we spent about 10 minutes talking, and he is deeply involved with this and really cares. I mean, he really does his research, and we had a great discussion. So, and that was one of the things we talked about, of how this 50-year window that he's been walking through, and he's really come to realize the reality of this, and he's talking about it publicly. So I believe, just to add this, it's not really related to the question, but not only is his movie itself really going to impact the culture, but I also think the statements he is making publicly about his own acceptance of the reality of the phenomenon and of the, the problems with the secrecy. I mean, he's standing behind the disclosure movement. And for a cultural icon like that to do that really means a lot. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, Leslie, we're hoping to give him an award on June 25th at our event. And we've invited him, and we know he's got a busy schedule, and it's probably a long shot, but we'd like to recognize his achievements in this area and his impact on popular culture. So we're hoping he might be able to attend.
Well, I'm hoping too, and I'm hoping I can help make that happen. So we'll see how it all plays out. Anyway, I guess it's time. We've been on this for 2 hours, and we could go. I'd love to talk to you guys another hour, but we're all busy. I think this was a fantastic conversation. I know there's a lot more questions, and we apologize to the Reddit contributors who wrote very thoughtful questions that we just don't have time to answer, but we'll do other shows like this and answer more questions. So I just want to thank both of you, Jordan and Chris, and also Hunt, for joining us today and providing, so much insight and wisdom to our audience. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to the Reddit people who make this happen. There's a team of very dedicated volunteers who are committed to these AMAs, and they work very hard to make them happen. And even though we sometimes have technical problems, that's not their fault. Things happen, and then they handle it very well. So I wanted to, really thank everyone who's backstage on this. And we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Leslie. See you, Jordan.